Hello, interested parties. Today I am discussing with you how social and cultural trends can affect a non communicable disease. To begin, I'll explain the disease and the stats surrounding it, why it demands your interest, and then discuss the cultural and societal changes that have affected the prevalence of the disease. The disease I'm talking about is type 2 diabetes. Type 2 diabetes is an incurable condition. Typically, when we ingest sugar, the pancreas secretes hormone insulin to turn that sugar into energy. The pancreas is well equipped to deal with quite large amounts of sugar. However, populations are now clearly eating larger quantities of sugar than can ever be converted to energy. And as such, the prevalence of diabetes type 2 is on the rise in populations around the world. The main factor concerning the health of people with type 2 diabetes is time. Over time, a diabetes sufferer will have damage to large blood vessels of the heart, brain, and legs, as well as damage to the small blood vessels in the eyes, kidneys, feet, which can result in strokes, and in some cases, deterioration of that tissue can no longer be fed blood to that area and will result in amputation. Toe and foot amputation is very common for long-term sufferers. Type 2 diabetes is a growing issue globally, and in Australia, the reason that this lifestyle disease has become such a big issue has a lot to do with our society and cultural attitudes towards our dietary habits. Our societal and cultural attitudes have been shaped by media and political misinformation, which has been funded by the same companies making the most out of our bad dietary habits. Some facts about the scale of diabetes in Australia include around 1.7 million Australians have diabetes. That includes all types of diagnosed diabetes. More than 100,000 Australians have developed diabetes in the past year. And total annual cost impact of diabetes in Australia is estimated at $14.6 billion. The facts and figures surrounding type 2 diabetes are astounding. If it were a communicable disease, it would be classed as a worldwide epidemic. And yet, because it is not a communicable disease, type 2 diabetes has, in a way, become an under-the-radar issue. The signs and symptoms of pre-diabetic situation are not visible, which means at the time of becoming a full-blown diabetic for some, it may come as a shock. Ironically, the pre-signs and symptoms include increased hunger and thirst. This becomes a ticking time bomb for the pre-diabetic because if the diet of this person includes excessive sugar amounts, the situation is likened to a ticking time bomb that is no longer ticking down in years but months. With the excess consumption, it becomes far more likely to result in obesity, assuming the person was not obese already. In terms of a public health issue, we are looking at these trends in type 2 diabetes as a real crisis, with 1 in 10 Australians is classed as pre-diabetic or with diabetes. We are looking at the cost of treating this disease as a balloon for taxpayer funding. Although Medicare was never made to make a profit, it was certainly never devised as an open check for unhealthy dietary choices and fast food companies to act with extreme negligence. I will discuss some of the changes in socio-cultural changes that Australia has gone through to affect the prevalence of diabetes. Australians are very much canaries in the coal mine. American fast food companies were hugely successful in America from the 1970s onwards, but it wasn't until the 1980s that those companies made it to Australian shores. At that time, type 2 diabetes was a rare disease which tended to only affect older people. It was actually commonly referred to as old people's disease. With very little regulation on amounts of dietary requirements and no laws regarding how the fast food companies could advertise themselves, the phenomena quickly exploded and the dietary makeup and disease and obesity trends of Australia would never be the same again. Australia has experienced a transition of our food and dietary habits becoming excessive in sugar intake. This makes type 2 diabetes harder to avoid, and one of our social and cultural changes is a modern supermarket is split into 2 areas, with the front, back, and some sides being fresh foods and the middle being all preserved foods. The mix is typically now 50-50, but believe it or not, it wasn't always this way. The market used to be mostly all fresh foods, with some preservatives in the middle, with more of an 80-20 split. It says a lot about our cultural dietary choices and how type 2 diabetes is so prolific, because food that are preserved are more likely to contain larger amounts of added sugar. Another cultural change is our choices of high sugar intake foods have exploded. During the 1950s, people were told fats are bad, so they took out fats from food and replaced it with sugar. Even a typical yogurt, which some people might think is healthy, is often per serving including 9 to 15 grams of sugar. Another big driver of our diabetes type 2 trend is sugar-sweetened beverages. Some have levels as high as 40 grams per serving, and the trends at which Australians are consuming these drinks is massive. These figures that I'm about to talk about come from industry-produced records on sugar-sweetened litres sold to the Australian public over the year of 2012. So a survey found that 47% of children aged 2 to 16 consumed sugar-sweetened beverages, including energy drinks, every day. In 2012, Australians bought 1.28 billion litres of carbonated drinks with added sugar, and research has shown that consuming just 340 millilitres of a sugary drink a day, which is actually less than one can, increases your risk of type 2 diabetes by 22%. So if we take that 1.28 billion litres and divide it by our population of 23 million, we're looking at 5,565 litres per Australian. If we then divide that by the 365 days per year, we're looking at 15 litres per Australian per day. All of these statistics say a lot about the changing new culture of excessive sugar intake. Australia is now the 15th fattest country on earth, with 31% of its population now classed as obese. A common complaint that a lot of these people seem to suggest is that they feel like the amount that they're consuming doesn't change, and then at some point they just balloon to obese weight brackets. Most of the blame for this is because of past society and cultural misinformation. We were taught that it was the quantity of food, i.e. caloric intake, was to blame for obesity. The mantra was, just count your caloric intake, and as long as it was less than your output, you would remain the same weight. During a time where excessive sugar treats and foods were rare, this might have made sense. However, what is not factored into calories is kilojoules. Now, kilojoules are a measure of energy in form of sugar, carbohydrates, and food. If you do not burn the kilojoules you intake, it immediately gets stored to fat around the organs to be burnt later. This is actually a visible trend relating to excessive sugar intake, because now the modern fat person tend to be carrying a lot of weight around their mid-abdomen, but relatively smaller amounts around other areas. I would encourage you to note how many larger people you see walking around with relatively skinnier legs and arms, but a very large abdomen area, and you will see the scale at which excessive sugar is at work. So why am I talking about obesity? Well, current obesity trends are more linked to excessive sugar and sodium consumption, as is diabetes type 2. As obesity and diabetic trends become a norm, statistics don't really have a shock and awe effect on the people. The society and the culture of poor biometric standards are becoming normal. In some towns in Texas, America, the local ambulance service had to buy all new ambulances to accommodate people that were too large to fit in the back. The mortuary or morgue had to buy bigger coffins, hearses, and tables for autopsy. The local eateries had to widen the size of their doors just so the population could walk through them. If we are to buck the trend of the American diabetes and obesity issue, we have to take steps as a nation to change. All of this begs the question of what society is trying to do to combat this growing trend of more type 2 diabetes diagnosis, as well as the diagnosing in children. The answer is not much. Policies have been incredibly slow to react, with politicians influenced by money from unhealthy food companies through political donations. The only headway we have had has been trivial changes towards nutritional information must be posted on the packaging of all foods sold in terms of calories and kilojoules. Which begs the question, how many consumers read that information? And two, how many of them understand that information? The only other change is in advertising, that they can no longer call themselves healthy food. However, they still market themselves using words like fresh and sustainable, which could give the illusion that they're not as bad for your dietary health as made out to be. Media plays a huge role in society and cultural norms, and although commercial news programs will run journalistic reviews of how fat our society has become, those same news stations are sponsored by those same junk food and sugar-sweetened beverage companies, making it highly unlikely that in the report they will ever be mentioned and who might be to blame. Instead, they will say things like, it's all to do with how much exercise people are getting. And even ironically, after the news stations run their news program, they might even have ads for companies like McDonald's or KFC or Coke. When McDonald's or KFC bring out new burgers, somehow, it's a news story. It's not a negative news story either. It will state instead, oh, McDonald's introduced this new burger. This is what's in it. Look how great it is. This is all relevant to our social and cultural makeup, as a lot of people come to the news for facts and information, and what they're being told is that there's nothing wrong with what these products have in them, and they're safe to consume in any quantity. The culture of misinformation and sponsored content is a real issue. So thanks for listening. I'm sure this talk has opened your eyes to how our societal and cultural attitudes towards dietary habits has been shaped to allow for type 2 diabetes to become such a widespread issue in Australia. I hope that you will lean on lawmakers to change laws around how much sugar should be allowed in food, but more importantly, how much misinformation is out there to confuse consumers about their dietary habits. Thanks.